Da li se religija u savremenom svijetu povlači iz javne sfere u privatne živote vjerujućih pojedinaca? Ili je obrnuto, religija je sve prisutnija u javnosti, a sve odsutnija iz života vjernika? Zašto ne možemo govoriti o opadanju religije i krizi vjere, a da ne pomenemo renesansu vjere koja se dešava u pojedinim vjerskim zajednicama? Kako se religija transformiše u duhovnost, u ideologiju, u politički identitet? I zbog čega je za istraživače koji imaju ambiciju da sagledaju religiju u modernoj Europi važno da imaju na umu da je u pitanju kontekst koji je u neprekidnoj promjeni? Ova i brojna druga, ne manje zanimljiva pitanja postavila je poznata britanska sociološkinja religije Grejs Dejvi, održavši nedavno na Univerzitetu Crne Gore predavanje pod nazivom Religija u savremenoj Europi, kontekst koji se stalno mijenja. Profesorica Dejvi autorka je brojnih knjiga iz oblasti sociologije religije. Religije u Britaniji od 1945. Vjerovanje bez pripadanja. Religije u modernoj Europi, memorija koja mutira. Sociologija religije, kritička agenda. Između ostaloga je i koautorka Oxfordovog priručnika o Europi i religiji. Njeno gostovanje je organizovano u sklopu istraživačkog projekta koji Crnogorski institut za napredne studije realizuje uz podršku Univerziteta u Oxfordu. Professor Dejvi, let's open this interview by explaining the concept of believing without belonging that you are famous for. So what is it and how did you come up with this idea?
In quite early days when I was studying, it was partly an invitation to do a piece of work for a commission that was set up in Britain, and it was concerned with churches, the role of churches in big cities, notably more deprived parts of cities, where people's lives were not at all easy. And these people, this was back in the 1980s, these people didn't often go to church, and you could have said, well, look, the church has failed, it hasn't connected with this group of the population. But the more I looked, the more I understood that they did feel attachment, sometimes through belief, but simply presence. They wanted that building there, they wanted the priests there, and had often in that kind of part of the city they had lost, for example, their school, they'd lost their library, they'd lost many public services, so the church was the only thing left. And so they retained this attachment and said, yes, I believe in God, I don't go to church, but I believe in God. Now, the God might be rather vague, not very specific, but it was not secular. And I was trying to find ways to describe this. And I alighted on believing without belonging. And suddenly it caught the imagination of so many people. And people began to talk about it and write about it. And then people turned it round the other way, belonging without believing, and what did that mean? And I suddenly was being invited to go here and there, and it seemed that it had touched something that needed explanation.
As you have just mentioned, the people inspired by your ideas explored what would belonging without believing mean. How do you perceive this concept?
Yes. Now, belonging without believing is not... my Nordic colleagues, I worked quite a bit in the Northern Europe. My Swedish, Norwegian, Danish colleagues used to say, but in Denmark and Sweden it's different. They have a much stronger concept of religious membership than in the church in England, because they pay church tax, and so their record of membership is important, because then they pay part of their taxes to the church. And often the thinking there is you pay your church tax and you paid these people to do a good job for you. So, you know, the belonging aspect is more important than belief, and often in the Nordic countries, people's belief is quite innovative, put it that way. I don't think that's dangerous. What I think is worrying is when people say that to be Danish or to be Swedish or to be English, you have to belong to the dominant faith. And if you don't, you're not one of us. And that's where it's turned negative. In other words, it becomes a condition for becoming Swedish or becoming... and I know, I mean, the experience tells me, the data tells me that this is directed towards Islam, which is a very different sort of faith, and there's quite a significant number of Muslims in our countries now. We're aware that we have in our countries minorities who have a very separate way of being religious, and it's often associated with another world faith, and notably Islam. In Britain, the number of Hindus as well. And I think, you know, that their way of being, their way of living is, for some parts of our society, not all, for some people in our society, challenging. And then I think religion can be weaponized to exclude rather than include. That word weaponization is important. And it's unpleasant. Now, interestingly, you find people in the churches who are believers as well, who are, have quite a strong sense of theology, will often reject that attitude of exclusion. And often because they've heard in the narrative that a Christian in such churches should welcome the stranger. Now, what is much less acceptable is if you've never heard the narrative, but you're just using the framework to exclude. So you've emptied your framework of theology, and it becomes a question of identity, not of belief or practice. And I see that sometimes it can happen in a variety of ways, some of which are really quite benign, like there's no problem about valuing our heritage or valuing our culture. I mean, we should do that, even if you don't believe. You value the buildings, you value the art, you value the music. But it's when you begin to use the structure as a condition of membership, as it were, of condition of being one of us. That, I think, is what I'm trying to say, is should be discouraged.
Let's mention that you also introduced the concept of vicarious religion. So what is this concept referring to?
We've already talked a little bit about believing without belonging. And I think, as I said in my lecture this morning, I was trying to find some way of indicating that hard variables in the church, or hard indicators of religion, were declining. We were becoming more secular. But the soft indicators, the ways we continue to attach ourselves to churches, were still quite strong. I think they're fading now, but certainly in the 1980s this was the case. And I used initially this contrast between believing without belonging. People continue to say, I believe in God, even if they don't attend their churches. So that was believing without belonging. And then I thought, and I had talked quite a bit to my Scandinavian colleagues, Nordic colleagues, and I thought, well, belief and belonging can be, both of them can be either hard or soft. You can have, as I said this morning, I believe in God. It's quite vague. I don't really know how to explain it, but I think there's something there. Or you can say a creed, a very specific statement of belief. And that's strong. That's strong, but it's still belief. Now, in terms of belonging, you can say, yes, I go to church every Sunday, perhaps in the week as well. Or, I don't go to church, but I still belong. It's my church. and please respect that. I don't want you to take it away. And in order to sort of bring these things together, I use this word of vicarious religion, of feeling attached to a church in which a minority does the work, the professionals, but also a group of active people, and I don't share all their convictions, and I don't necessarily want to be part of that, but it's a good thing that they do that. And often they're generous, they often work hard in the charity sector, they're engaged in welfare, they're often good citizens. Not invariably, but often. So I respect them, and I'm glad they keep that institution going, but I'll sit back. But please keep it there. And the way it actually works is a bit different in different societies, because, as I say, where there's a church tax system, it very definitely the wider population are paying for something. Like, we pay for welfare, we pay for education, we pay for the church. Now, in Britain, that isn't the case. So it's now getting very difficult to maintain the church, because fewer and fewer people are giving the money, but the institution remains pretty large. And paying for the buildings, paying for the priests is getting very tricky.
Profesorica Dejvi u svom plodnom naučnom radu pratila je, kako sama kaže, fascinantne obrasce religije i sekularizacije, pažljivo posmatrajući društveno vidljive fenomene sa posebnom istraživačkom strašću za ono što nije lako vidljivo. U tom pogledu je posebno zanimljiva ideja vikarske religije.
Vicarious is a secular word. I mean, if you look at vicarious in the dictionary, it will say to do something on behalf of somebody else. I mean, but part of the root of it is I mean, the Pope is the vicar of Christ. He represents Christ. And in the English Church, our parish priests, not all of them, but most of them are called vicars, because they're doing something on behalf of the bishop. They're the representative of the church in a particular place. Many churches embody memory, personal memory, collective memory, national memory. And I began to think about this idea of the church being an institution that does things on our behalf, which is what vicarious means. Now, I think vicarious religion is always difficult to study, because it is like an iceberg. You see the little bit that sticks out of the water, but you know that underneath there's a lot of implicit memory and a lot of unspoken assumptions. And one of the challenges for my discipline, for sociology, is to find ways of studying what you can't see. So you can't count it and you can't measure it. You have to have a good sociological imagination to understand what is going on underneath the water, what is holding up that iceberg that shows. And you can say, well, relatively few people are involved now, it's not such an important institution. And I think that's a little bit dangerous, because sometimes when you begin to dig at this, or say we don't need it, you find that you're exposing quite a lot of what wasn't immediately visible, and you need to pay attention to that as well.
You often refer to two royal funerals in the UK as great examples of vicarious religion. Why?
The first one was the Duke of Edinburgh, and he was, I mean, he was a very, very old man. You know, we knew that he couldn't live much longer, but it was in the middle of COVID, and so there couldn't be a state funeral, or a big funeral with the carriages and the soldiers and the marching, and because we were too restricted. So it took place in the chapel at Windsor Castle rather than Westminster Abbey. And it was absolutely stripped down to essentials. I mean, the family were there. The Queen was there by herself, sitting alone. That was a very poignant, you know, nobody sat next to her. And then her children and grandchildren. And the priest. And instead of the big choir, they had 4 singers, you know, the 4 voices, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. So they just had 4 individuals singing the liturgy, or the parts of the liturgy that had been chosen. And it was like a skeleton, but it was beautifully done. And that was vicarious religion. It was done, you know, it was televised, of course, live, so huge audience, but in itself simple and stripped, but all the essentials were there. And it ended with, I mean, this is, it's very Scottish rather than English, it ended with a piper. You know what I mean? In Scotland they play bagpipes, and at the end of a funeral, the piper just walked away and the sound left the chapel, you know? And then that was the end. I mean, then a couple of years later, I can't remember the dates exactly, we had the Queen's funeral, which was huge in terms of it, a really big state occasion. And again, it was exactly the same, but somehow the simplicity of the first one was very striking.
You stress in your books that religion per se might not necessarily cause conflicts and problems nor resolve them. However, religion is very powerful, and it can be used for both good and bad purposes. Could you give us some examples?
There's different elements of religion. You think of it as there are religious leaders. There is an ethic in religion, a theology, which is an ethic. You've got teaching, much of which is very positive about loving your neighbour. Not necessarily, but there's a body of thinking and teaching. You've got a group of people who form parishes and churches. So you've got communities, and you've got extremely powerful dissemination networks. You've got networks spreading into society. Now that's a very powerful combination. But you hitch it to the wrong train, to the wrong engine, and it can take you in the wrong direction. And then it can be very dangerous. But you can, if it's pushing in a positive direction, it can really make a difference. And the example I explained this morning was the example of Ebola in West Africa. Before COVID, it was a kind of rehearsal for COVID almost in some ways. When they realised, eventually, I suppose the medical people began to realise this, that the point of contagion was very often the burial practice of Muslim communities in that part of Africa. And the disease was being passed on at these funerals. And how was this how were they going to stop this? I mean, they couldn't. It would be very difficult for the secular authorities to say, you know, you can't do this anymore. That would have been seen as inappropriate and probably resented. But it was the imams themselves who understood what was happening and worked with the medical authorities to say we must suspend this for the time being. And this was transformative. And it really did begin to bring the epidemic to an end, which has been written up in a number of journals, often medical journals, and I find that very interesting. This is not written up in religious journals, it's written up in medical journals, including The Lancet, which is a very persuasive, it's a very well thought of journal in the medical world. And they did a whole series of kind of journalistic interventions on this to demonstrate how powerful this was. And there's another very interesting example, which happened when Pope Francis published Laudato Si, which was the, I'm sure you've covered that, you know, the encyclical on the on the environment. I think I don't know whether it is a British or American journal, to be honest, but it's called Nature, and it's one of the most sought after journals. If you want to get promotion in your university, you get your article published in Nature. I mean, that's the gold standard. And on the day that Laudato Si was published, Nature published a leader on the encyclical and the fact that it came from Catholic authorship. And I, frankly, was astonished to see this. It starts by saying the science is basically good. You know, there's nothing wrong with the science that was quoted and used in the argument. But no secular organisation, no professional organisation in science or in the environment can possibly equal the Catholic Church in terms of dissemination. The network is beyond imagining as far as science is concerned. And it was so affirming of this document authored by the Church because of its value in transmitting good practice. And in fact, if you look, you can word search it in Nature. You can find several versions of that. I find that absolutely fascinating. And to be honest, I never thought I would see that in my professional life. But that's a very good example of the leader, the inspiration, the institution, the network, and particularly Sunday by Sunday gathering through which this message is transmitted. That will reach further than any scientific discussion. Amazing. It's very, very interesting. And as I say, that blew my mind. I didn't think I'd see that.
And this very example confirms that Thomas Halleck was right when he perceived in his recent book, The Afternoon of Christianity, religion in modern world as complex, contradictory, and continually evolving context. You mentioned this book during your lecture today quite a few times. So why do you find it so relevant?
But what I like is he appreciates the richness and the complexity of the present context. If you look around, you can see decline. You can see churches getting smaller. You can see pockets of growth. You can see some kinds of growth which you'd rather not see. It's not always the bits that you want to grow that are growing. You can see, or some people in the churches interpret this as a possibility for evangelism. Others see it differently. What happens when... I think one of the most striking things, he doesn't say this absolutely specifically, but I was very struck when I began to realise that what I had learnt as a young student, that religion would first drain away from the public space, but individuals could stay to pray and practice and believe if they wanted to. Obviously that was proscribed in some communist countries. But what has happened is that religion is draining away from many private lives in the West, but the public space is full of it because we have to manage pluralism. So it's contentious and difficult, and you know the public sphere is engaged in trying to find answers to difficult questions. And you know, why is it that the Muslim community is getting bigger? I was in Vienna just last weekend, and I was very astonished by the was it examples of statistics of religious practice and how they organise their religion in schools as a result of that. And the number of Muslims was higher than the number of practising Catholics. I was astonished, not in the whole of Austria, but in the capital city. And it's not always where you expect it. Suddenly, something happens that you didn't expect. And that, as I think I said this morning, it is so important to recognize the new and the unexpected, and not to insist that your theory is saying that it's going to be more secular, so it can't be there. It is there, and you have to take notice of it. And that Thomas Halleck does. You know, we have to recognize this confusion, this richness, not because it makes our, my life as a scholar easier. It makes it more interesting, but it's not easy. How do I find ways to understand and explain that?
At the very end of this interview, I'm curious to know what is your personal connection with religion?
Provided you understand faith is the opposite of certainty, I have faith. Okay? But there's a lot of things that I continue to think about. Yes, think of faith as the opposite of certainty, and then I can say I have faith. But I remain very uncertain about things too.